Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with Professor Kevin Milligan from UBC, and there's been a lot of talk in the last couple of weeks about interprovincial trade barriers because there's this notion that if we unlock these, then we're going to unlock all kinds of GDP growth within the country. But it's easier said than done. And Kevin has been saying some really smart things over on Bluesky, so I figured we'd have a quick chat. Kevin, let's talk about what these barriers are, because I think a lot of people don't quite understand the nature of them.
So in Canada, we have some barriers that make it harder to conduct business in different provinces. And these aren't tariffs, like there's not a tax at the border.
Yeah.
If you are trying to take goods from one place to another in most circumstances. What we're talking about, these internal non-tariff barriers, are things like safety regulations, things like professional accreditation. So if you are licensed to perform some kind of trade, some kind of profession in one province, can you work in other places? If you have safety equipment, is it the same across the country? If you're trying to, if you're Canadian Tire trying to stock safety equipment, do you have to look at different purchases for each province? Obviously, it'd be easier if they can just buy one big container load and send it to all the Canadian Tires across the country.
Yeah.
But that's not the case because there are some safety differences, safety regulation differences. So on this, is there a potential gain in economic efficiency and some foregone GDP if we were to wave a wand and erase these barriers? Yeah, there is. I mean, economist Trevor Tome from the University of Calgary has an excellent study from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute that looks specifically at the trucking industry. And he argues that if you were to have the same safety regulations for trucking across the country, you might see trucking costs decrease by 7 or 8%. That's, a lot of stuff get trucked around, and that's going to affect prices in the store. That's great. Where I inject some caution here is about how you'd get there.
Right. Yeah, I know this has only been plaguing government since 1867, and I know the Liberals did make progress on this in 2017 when they got this Canadian trade agreement where they reduced everything to a negative list, which for viewers means that the essential agreement is everything interprovincial trade is free with the exception of these items. And that was seen as a very big thing back in the day because it had taken them a long time to get to this point.
Yeah, so one of my favorite dictums is we like outside the box thinking, but I like to hear it most from those who understand why the box was created in the first place, because I think it avoids errors. When I see that there's some barrier that since 1867 has made this not be resolved, if I decide I want to get through that barrier, and it's an important thing to get through, I would like there to be more easily trade between provinces, but I want to understand what that barrier is before I go and approach it. Think of it as, I want to know, should I bring a tank with me? Should I bring a team of ninjas with me? When I want to get through that barrier, what tools do I need to bring with me? Right. So in this case, think about these different things. Think about the safety regulations. Let's go back to the issue of trucking. I just read that the Prime Minister was talking about the trucking issue this morning in his growth summit in Toronto about truck tires. Well, this is still not trivial. If you look at Trevor Tome's paper, what he's advocating for is not uniform regulations from Ottawa for all countries. And I will note parenthetically here that it is a bit amusing that provinces that do things like pass a sovereignty act are the ones really pushing for someone else to tell them how to regulate their industries.
Yes.
That kind of blows my mind a bit. And that's
someone else. Consistency there.
Yeah. Now, that someone else doesn't necessarily need to be Ottawa. The thing that a lot of people push in this area is what they call mutual recognition. So that means that if you're Alberta, just to pick an example, that so long as you are licensed, whether it's, you're a pharmacist, you're a truck driver, whatever it might be, licensed somewhere else in Canada, we're going to recognize that. So whatever you needed to get through your professional exams or whatever somewhere else, we're just going to accept that. Right. But you can see where the problem is there. In order to get there, you need to assure that there's no missing links across Canada, that everyone adheres to a minimum standard. Yeah. If some province is handing out trucking licenses out of cereal boxes, then what's going to happen is some truck driver is going to plow into a busload of hockey players.
Yeah. Yeah.
This means this is a serious thing. In British Columbia, we have mountains. There's snowy mountains. We have very detailed regulations for commercial trucking when you have to put chains on your tires, how big these trucks can be, because they have to go through these snaky mountain passes. Yeah. Now, I love Prince Edward Island. My family's from Prince Edward Island, but they don't have snowy mountains there. So they just don't have that. They may have like rules of how many potatoes you can carry in your truck, right? And we might not have them here. This is why we have federalism. There's different needs in different parts of the country, which doesn't mean you don't want to try to regulate, get rid of some of these barriers between provinces. What it means is it's a nitpicky process. You have to have all the ministries of transportation across the country sit around a table, and someone proposes, okay, here's a Canada-wide standard. And the wiseacre from BC puts up his hand and says, what about snow tires? The wise guy from PEI puts up his hand, what about too many potatoes on a truck? And they can work this out, right? I'm not here to say this isn't worth doing and it's impossible and we should wave up our hands. I am just suggesting that this is not something that we can wave a magic wand and do. Now, on that point, though, we've seen Minister Anand yesterday saying we're going to get some of this done in 30 days. I heard the same thing from the Prime Minister this morning. What's going on here? Let's talk a little politics, Dale. At least intergovernmental politics, anyway. Like, the barrier to doing this was not the federal government. The federal government was happy to convene a meeting of those transportation ministers or whatever. I can almost guarantee you, Dale, that there was some province around that table who's working slow on this. Yeah. And didn't want to. They commissioned a task force. Maybe the trucking industry in their province was like, oh no, we don't want to go too fast with that. Or maybe it was the Teamsters, some union side. I don't know where it was. Some group representing either the truckers or the workers or whatever was putting some sand in the gears here, saying slow it down. Want to make sure that we don't mess up, workers' rights. If it's the labor unions. The business owners don't impose more costs on us. You bring us all up to some national standard. That's going to cost me money. That's what was slowing it down, right? And so when you see Minister Anand say, hell yeah, let's do it in 30 days, that's her calling the bluff of these provincial premiers who are grandstanding out there on this issue. Why don't we have interprovincial free trade? Listen, buddies. The reason is it's because you are slow walking this process. Yeah. So some people maybe were surprised to see this Liberal government kind of grab this issue in the last few days and say, yeah, hell yeah, we're going to do this. The reason is it's like they're calling the bluff of the provinces on this. And frankly, I hope that the provinces are held to account for this because they're the ones who are slow walking it. And again, for those who just wish that the Prime Minister can walk into the room and just decree that there are no interprovincial trade barriers, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, but my understanding of the Constitution says that's a bit tricky to do. There's no constitutional lever that he's just not pulling in his office. It's and I think most people don't understand that either. That these are situated within the provinces, and the federal government's power is basically to convene. It is an important one, the power to convene and to make it a priority. The Prime Minister and Vice Premiers, we're going to be there. We'll give you some coffee and donuts, and we're going to sit around our table and get it done. And you're going to bring your frickin' transport ministers, and we're going to figure out this tire issue. That does get stuff done. So, when Mr. Poilievre was pushing on this as something he would do, that it does matter when you make a priority. But at the end of the day, if some premier is slow walking it, that's up to that premier. And so I did find it a bit amusing to watch the surprise of people saying, wow, the Liberals are getting all this really fast. It's like, they're like, no, someone is they're just calling the bluff of the premiers who are slow walking this. Yeah,
for sure. One of the things that our friend Mike Moffat had tweeted a few days ago was that there are basically three different options for how to make these things work. And one of them is upload the regulations to Ottawa, which no province wants to give up that level of sovereignty. The second one was to create an EU-like structure for the provinces to all buy into where they can hash these things out in that in that place, but also make that mandatory or binding from what those decisions get made. And his third one was somewhat tongue in cheek: join the EU, and we are forced to adopt their regulations. I just kind of wanted to get your thought on what at least the first two of those we might see.
Yeah, seeing the federal government take over regulation of some of these things, again, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I don't know whether that's possible, but that's one way to go. And I frankly don't like that because I see that there are some real differences in safety needs across the country, and I'm not sure someone in Ottawa is going to be as attuned to that as people in the provinces. The mutual recognition thing, that having a common core standard that provinces can then add some more to, is a good approach, but it does take time. Not a big fan of doing stuff from Ottawa. In terms of the hashing out some kind of harmonization of regulations, taking the example of the EU, there are countries who are on a path to joining the EU. Ukraine is one that has been announced as that's a particular example for geopolitical reasons, but there are some others in Eastern Central Europe. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones.
I think one of them's like Moldova, and one of them.
Yeah, exactly. And what you'll see when if you look at these announcements, what they'll announce is the EU has accepted them as like a candidate on the path. One of the ways you get there to actually be considered for membership is that you have adopted, I don't have the phrase in front of me, but it's a common body of regulations and laws that adhere to EU standards. And so this comes down to everything, like these truck tire regulations, like professional accreditation, like house zoning, and there's so many different things where there's EU standards, and it takes time to get all of your laws lined up with it. So that's why this is a multi-year process. There's never been a case where the EU says, oh, okay, you're invited in as of January 1st, 5 months from now. That's not how it works. It takes years for each country to get ready for it. So again, as a quick response, we want to grow the economy in 2025 by, doing any of this regulation stuff. That's just, it's a good goal. I think the EU is a positive institution for the world. I think having it a bit bigger in other countries in Europe is not a crazy thing. But everyone knows it's a path to get there. And you can move it more quickly, but it's going to be a path because there's a necessity of having this common regulatory framework. So should Canada just join the EU? Well,
that's the kind of thing I was going to ask next, because this is one of the things that some people are semi-seriously floating in the wake of Trump's various predations.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just go there. So I think Mike's logic is right on thinking about what it would be, the possibilities of doing it in those ways. But again, these processes are, hard things are hard, right? And they're hard for a reason. You just have to make sure that you have a lot of determination if you're going to get there, but also the right tools, whether it's the ninjas or the tanks. So in terms of the EU, a couple of things. I think this comes from a good place. People are suggesting it. They're like, the EU is a positive force for human rights and trade and lots of other things in the world. Canada has a lot of things in common with them in those fronts. Perhaps we're better aligned there than within, NAFTA 3.0. Maybe that's where it's coming from, and maybe we want to expand trade and expand investment, expand mobility of people a bit. That comes from a good place. But I think there's also a bit of a misunderstanding of what the EU actually is. The EU is not just a free trade agreement. There is a European Free Trade Association. But that's only one component of the EU. One of the founding principles of the EU is the four freedoms. This is not Roosevelt's four freedoms. This is a different one. This is the EU version. Freedom of movement of goods, of labor, of people, of capital, and of business. And look at any one of those, the freedom of movement of goods, that involves these regulation stuff. If I have a can of tomatoes that is, satisfies the rules in Belgium, I can just put it on a truck and go and sell it in Italy.
Yeah.
Right? There are that's the magic of the EU. There aren't border crossings. You just take your load of tomatoes across these borders. Similarly, and this is so that's one thing. The common regulatory framework is there. We would have to adopt the EU's common regulatory framework, which would be boy, talking about sovereignty, I mean, we'd be ceding a lot of
Yeah.
regulatory sovereignty to Brussels, and people in Europe are a bit grumpy about that, and to the extent that the UK pulled out of it because they were grumpy about that. But actually, it wasn't this the standardized sizes for cans of tomatoes that pulled them out. It was another one of the freedom of movement of people.
Yeah.
Anyone within the EU can just go and work in any other EU country. So it's really a lot harder to control immigration within the EU.
Yeah.
And we've had a few conversations, Dale, in Canada over the past year about immigration. And can you imagine if, like, there were a bunch of migrants who are landing in Italy, and then once in the EU, we're able to just come to Canada, and we had no control over it? That's, again, why people in the EU have been a bit up and on, because that's exactly what's been happening. And there's lots of human rights issues there. And I'm not saying Italy shouldn't accept migrants. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What I am suggesting is that to the extent that we want to think carefully about our immigration system and control Canada's immigration system for Canada's needs, the EU would be a very different world from that.
Yeah,
just other quick examples on that. There's a common foreign policy. There is a need for any new EU adherent to make paths towards joining the euro, common currency. Now, when I said that on social media, people are like, "Oh, Kevin, you're so dumb. You don't know anything. The UK didn't have the euro, and Denmark doesn't, and Sweden doesn't." I do know what I'm talking about on this. The EU's rule is that any new country, the UK was grandfathered in. They got a special deal.
Yeah.
Denmark got a special deal because those who know their EU history know there was a referendum that failed in Denmark. They had to have a second referendum. The EU gave them a special deal. Maybe the EU would give us a special deal. I don't know. But they're not giving that to anyone else.
Right.
Sweden, they still have the crown, but they have to make paths towards. This is their commitment. Maybe it's going to be a long path, a 20-year path. My point is, I don't think we want even any path of a commitment towards going towards the euro. The reason is the Canadian economy is very different from the European economy. We have resources. We have a lot of trade with the US, a lot of trade with Asia. We just have a very different economy. And so when different commodity shocks hit us, we have that exchange rate as a buffer. If we were locked into some kind of fixed exchange rate with the euro, that would be a disaster for the Canadian economy, a pure disaster. So for all of these reasons, we likely want to have some control of immigration here. I'm not sure we have the same security issues as the EU. We have a border with the US. They don't really. Foreign policy stuff, currency stuff. There's a lot of reasons why I think the EU thing would be a non-starter. Doesn't mean more making our free trade agreement, the one we already have, deeper. More investment, more freedom of movement of people, of making it easier to get visas to work in one another. These are all great things for us to work towards. But, in terms of EU membership, I just throw the whole bucket of cold water on that. Like, I'm not aboard for that one.
Yeah. I don't think people quite understand the depth to which that integration happens. And I mean, as much as people are worrying about, this notion that people like Kevin O'Leary are throwing around about, like, Canada having a common currency with the US, again, would we want to actually see that sovereignty when they wouldn't give us much in return? It's similar conversation would have to be had with the euro.
Yeah, so if we had a customs union with the U.S. where we had common tariffs externally, which is a possibility. That's called a customs union, where you have the same tariff meat chart for every country in the customs union. So once something is in, they can go across. There's some regulations you have to deal with. Have a common tariff. That's a progress beyond a free trade agreement that one can think about. But there is a cost of sovereignty to that. But on the currency again, I want to go back to that. Sometimes people think, our currency is now at whatever it is, 69 cents. We'll remember that 20 years ago we were over par.
Yeah.
And there was a time
it wasn't even 20 years ago. It was like 5 years ago.
Yeah, it wasn't long ago.
Yeah.
And there was a time in the 90s when we were at like 90 or 62 cents, right? So people see these fluctuations, and I remember people saying we should just lock in and when it's good. But what they misunderstand is the thing that's moving the currency around are big economic forces, commodities, their prices, trade flows. That's what moves the currency around. if we do not have that currency shock absorber, those big economic forces will manifest in other ways in the economy that are not good. They manifest in unemployment and manifest in firms that want to export being priced out of other markets. So when we see that exchange rate moving around, that is good for us. That's a shock absorber. If we get rid of that, it's going to be a really bumpy ride. So sometimes people frame the stuff about currency as like a sovereignty thing. I like to see King Charles on my coin. Maybe some people don't. Whatever. Not see President Trump on your coin. Whatever that might be. It's I'm likely there too. I mean, I don't want to see President Trump on any coin that I have to hold as legal tender. But that's not. It's not just a sovereignty thing. It's a serious economic argument. And I'm foursquare against any kind of fixed exchange rate with Europe, with the US, anywhere. Canada has a very different economy.
All right. Well, these are all very important things to think about. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And we'll chat again in the future.
Happy to talk.
All right. Thanks. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale on Twitter and JournoDale no underscore on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.